next unit, we'll be talking about ecology. And ecology is a very vast, broad subject, and it could be a class all in itself. So we're going to try to condense as much as we can in these videos for ecology. And of course, if you have any questions, you can certainly ask in class or just chat about it soon. So what is ecology? Well, this is the study of the interaction between living organisms and their environment. It's important to understand that there's a give and take here between all organisms that live together in this big old world of ours. So all organisms are affected by their environment, but all organisms affect their environment. So we as humans, we certainly affect our environment every day by our actions, but in return, we also affect our organisms are affected by our environment as well. So we as organisms, we're affected by the environment between weather patterns and climate and all sorts of different things out there. So it's a give and take. All organisms are affected, all organisms affect their environment. So just like other layers that we've talked about this year, ecosystems also have their own levels of organization. We've talked about it in terms of cells. We've talked about it in terms of, let's say, just organisms themselves. But now we're talking about this in terms of ecosystems. So it starts out with the species as being the lowest level of organization in an ecosystem. So we've talked about this before, that species are a group of similar organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. So I'm going to take a look at this as a pig. So if you take a look here, we have a single pig, which represents a species. So the pig species here. Please don't ask me the scientific name of this pig. Don't know, but just it's representing that. So the next level, as we're moving up to something that's a little larger, is called a population. And so a population is a group of organisms of the same species, and they live in the same area. Now we do know that pigs, of course, are spread out across the world, mostly because they're domesticated, but species do live in a very similar area. Take a look at the Galapagos Islands. We've been talking about finches for a very long time. We can talk about different types of insects. So these are definitely groups of organisms that live in the same area. Now, stepping up from that, our third level of organization of an ecosystem is a community. And a community is a group of interacting populations. And now in this case, we have our pigs, but we also have grass, we have the ants, we have birds. So these are all sorts of populations that interact with each other in a community. One step larger is what we've been talking about, our ecosystem. Now this is a community in its non-living environment. So if you take a look at the above picture, we have the pigs, the grasses, the birds, the insects. Now we also include the air, we include the rocks, we include things that are not living, the soil, things like that. Now, even one step larger on this is the biosphere. And we talked about this way at the beginning of the year, but the biosphere is the entire portion of the Earth inhabited by life. So this is a much larger version of everything. So the biosphere is everything. So these are the levels of organization within an ecosystem. So you notice they're a lot larger than what we've been previously talking about with the cells or organisms or things like that. Now, in an environment, there's definitely some components that we should be aware of. So we have some living factors and we have non-living factors, as I just mentioned. Now, the living factors are called biotic factors. Now, your biotic factors are your animals and your plants, your fungi, protists, bacteria. Anything that's living is considered a biotic component. Non-living factors are called abiotic factors. Now, these are anything in an environment that is non-living. Air, water, sunlight, soil, pollution, rocks, my favorite. So we have non-living factors and living factors within our environments. And all of this make up our biospheres, and actually they make up our ecosystems. So take a moment in this picture, just kind of see what are some of the biotic and abiotic factors that you see in the picture. So if you have mentioned some of the biotic features as being the bugs and the birds and the person, the cow back there, the trees, you are correct. If you are talking about some of the abiotic factors, then we have the water, we have the soil, we have air, the clouds, we have a whole bunch of non-living factors in this particular picture. Now, in your notes, I'd like for you to fill out this Venn diagram. Now, you can pause this video to fill this out. I'd like for you to fill out the Venn diagram with the biotic factors and the abiotic factors that you see here on this slide. So air, water, temperature, bacteria, sunlight, animals, soil, a dead cat, plants, and of course feces, poop. So go ahead and fill this out and answer that question down at the bottom. Which level of organization should be used to label the overlap of the two circles? So go ahead and pause this video and do that. So here is the answers to your Venn diagram. If you need to change anything, by all means, go ahead. So some of our biotic factors in that list, we have bacteria, plants, and animals. Some of the abiotic factors, we have temperature, sunlight, water, air, and soil. Now, some of the things that might go in the middle, we have a dead cat, because at one time it was living, but now it's dead. So we can kind of put that in the middle. Now, feces technically does have some living organisms in it, and at one time it probably was something that was living. So this is why I have it in the middle. Now, if you answered that question, which level of organization should be used to label the overlap of the two circles? If you said ecosystem, ding, 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 you would be correct. So awesome job there. Now let's talk a little bit about how energy flows in ecosystems. Now, we probably don't really know it or really understand, but we actually get all of our energy from other organisms. Yes, we have to eat food and we get our energy from that food. And we've talked about cellular respiration, we've talked about photosynthesis, we've talked about how our bodies break down some of these food items and release it as energy. So let's talk a little bit more about that, just on an ecosystem level instead of a cellular level. So most life on Earth depends on photosynthetic organisms for their food, either indirectly or directly. And these are broken down into two categories. We have producers or consumers. So producers, just as the name says, are organisms that make organic nutrients, usually using energy from sunlight through photosynthesis. So autotrophs, basically, are plants. We have algae as well, and some bacteria. These are our producers. Now, consumers are organisms that get energy by feeding on other organisms. These are our heterotrophs. So some examples, birds, insects, worms. We also have several different names for these particular consumers. They can be herbivores, which are animals that eat other plants. We have carnivores, which are animals that eat meat. We have omnivores, which eat both plants and animals. We have scavengers, which scavenge for food. They don't necessarily hunt directly, but they do hunt for things that are already dead. Kind of like oh my gosh, turkey vultures are an example. Decomposers and detrivores, these are organisms that do eat dead matter, and they are able to then kind of recycle some of those nutrients back into the soil. Now, we don't always include them in some of our upcoming food webs that we'll talk a little bit about, but decomposers and detrivores are very, very important in our ecosystems. So once we get to those points, we'll talk a little bit more about them. So as energy is passed from producer to consumer, less and less energy is actually available. So we can show this in either a food chain, a food web, or an ecological pyramid. And this might sound fairly similar to something you might have learned in middle school, for instance. The models that show the flow of energy through trophic levels are these three things: food chains, food webs, or ecological pyramids. So we're going to talk a little bit more about trophic levels here in a second, but I wanted to give you a very brief possible food chain that we might see. So we have grass. Grass is a producer, and that means that it gets its energy from the sun to produce food. Cows will eat the grass. Humans will eat a cow, and in the picture, it could be that the shark is eating the human. I know that's kind of a little morbid, but it is what it is. This is a food chain right here. So this is a possible food chain that you might see out in the environment. So what is a trophic level? Well, we have several, but we're going to talk about three of them just directly here. So we have something called the first trophic level, and this is a producer. Now, if you think of this in terms of a pyramid, our producers are going to be on the bottom. We have tons of producers out here, and that's because they are able to get energy directly from the sun to produce food. We have our second trophic level, so if you think about stepping up in our pyramid, this is our primary consumer, and these are organisms that eat plants and other primary producers. So a cow, for instance, would be a primary consumer, the first ones that eat the plants. At the third trophic level, so stepping up a little bit more of that pyramid, are our secondary consumers. Now these are the organisms that eat the second level organisms. These are carnivores. So we do have a fourth trophic level as well. It could go, but typically we only see 3 to 4 levels, trophic levels. Now, we could also eat at different trophic levels. So if you think of humans, while we cannot be producers, we are not at the first trophic level, but we could be primary consumers because we eat salads. We could be at the third trophic level because we are the ones to eat, let's say, cows. We could also be at the fourth trophic level. So we might eat other things that are carnivores, basically. We can eat, let's say, oh gosh, I am blanking off the top of my head what it is that we could eat. But we could be, depending upon an alligator, for instance. There we go. We could be there. So if we eat the alligator probably ate some other type of animal. That animal probably was a primary consumer. So we could probably, and there's some things that could eat at several different trophic levels. Now let's take a look at the three models of energy flow. I already gave you an example of a food chain. Granted, it might not be all that real, but a food chain is a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by being eaten or by eating. So we have at this side, in this case, this chain goes up. We have a primary consumer, which is the ones that get our energy from the sun. We have the primary consumers, which are the ones that eat the plants. And then we have secondary consumers, which will eat those primary consumers. Tertiary consumers, which eat the secondary. And then quaternary consumers, which eat tertiary. So our terrestrial food chain, if you look on the left, we have a plant being eaten by an herbivore, which is, in this case, an insect, looks like a grasshopper. A carnivore which is a mouse, which is eating the grasshopper or other insect. We have a snake eating the mouse, and then we have a hawk or a falcon eating the snake. If we take a look at the marine food chain, we have phytoplankton. This is like our plants. They just happen to live in the water. Now, phytoplankton is eaten by zooplankton. Zooplankton is eaten by these fish here. Don't know what, but they are eaten there. Then those fish are eaten by another type of fish, and then the top level consumer, our quaternary consumer, is the whale. So here's two different examples of a food chain for you that are actually real. We also have a food web. Now, if you take a look here, it's very intricate. There's a lot of interconnected food chains. You see here that these leaves are eaten by this insect, could be eaten by the mouse. This insect is then eaten by the mouse, the frog. We could have this frog being eaten by the owl or the snake. It's interconnected. And this really shows more about the interconnectedness of nature rather than not. And finally, our third model of energy flow is a bit more complicated, and this is called the ecological pyramid. And in this particular model, it shows the relative amount of energy at each level. And if you notice, it's going to decrease as we move up the chain or up this pyramid. So down here at the bottom, this is our producer, and these are the ones that get energy directly from the sun. As we move up, notice this little squirrel, which is going to eat those little peanuts. Notice how much energy gets lost. Basically, almost 90% of the energy is lost between that producer to that consumer. Now, this happens because at this level, the producer has its own needs as well to just survive, to go through cellular respiration and goes through all the things that it needs just to live. So as the squirrel eats it, it does need the energy, but it's only receiving about, it's receiving a lot less, maybe 10% of the energy from the previous level. And that continues up. Notice those secondary consumers are only receiving, again, 10% of the energy from that second level. And again, the top tertiary consumer here is going to only receive 10% of the previous level's energy. So it's very important to understand that the energy level decreases significantly in these cases. Now, as we go through in class, you're going to learn a little bit more about this energy decrease, and we'll practice more of that as we move forward.